But we're going to start because we only have an hour and we want to make the most of it, so people will join as they will. So you're all very welcome to the We Don't Buy It webinar, Prostitution Under COVID-19. I'm Barbara Condon, the CEO at Rahama, and I'm delighted to be joined with our partners today in this campaign, the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork, the Men's Development Network in Waterford, and Space International. You're going to be introduced to all of our partners in a little while. So I'm just going to go through with you the agenda for today. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the We Don't Buy It campaign. We're also joined today by Ruth Breslin of SERP, the Sexual Exploitation Research Group, and Ruth is going to present her research findings. We're then going to have a panel discussion. We're joined by Sorcha Pollock, who's a journalist with the Irish Times, and she's going to moderate the panel discussion. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So there's a chat function on the webinar. So please do send in your questions and we will answer them towards the end of the session. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the campaign. The We Don't Buy It campaign was an awareness campaign aimed at men and boys. It aimed to shine a national light on the myths surrounding the sex trade via the views of a Red C survey, posters, radio ads and social media. And I suppose while the landscape for buying sex changed during COVID-19, the context certainly hasn't. This campaign aimed to highlight that the motivations of men who are buying sex are based in a series of prevalent myths about the nature of the sex trade. So just in relation to the survey, the Red C survey was carried out by Persuasion Republic back in October last year, 2019, and it was amongst a representative national sample of the adult population. There was over 1,000 people in that survey. There was, I suppose, two main goals to the survey. The purpose was to establish awareness levels and attitudes towards the purchasing of sex in Ireland, and it was also to gauge opinions on how effective the law is in protecting those most vulnerable. So just in relation, I'll just move back there. I suppose just in relation to the survey, we had a launch of the campaign back in March, just before the lockdown. The launch was in Dublin and we presented an extensive presentation on the findings. So I'm not going to rehash the survey findings, but for the purpose of people who weren't there, I'm just going to give a brief snapshot of the key takeaways of the findings. We had hoped to launch in Cork and Waterford, but just after the Dublin launch, we went into lockdown. So that hampered some of the work of this campaign. But notwithstanding that, there was a lot of social media and a lot of media around the launch. And also we had a series of radio ads and posters going around. Those radio ads are currently live as well as part of the 16 days of activism of gender-based violence. So they're on every day during the 16 days, and we're halfway through that, through the 16 days of activism. So just moving on then to the key takeaways of the survey. So 6% of men admitted to having purchased sexual services. That was 8% in 2015, so it's down 2%. But obviously you have to allow for the margin of error in any survey. 70% of respondents were aware that it's a criminal offence to purchase sex in Ireland. 64% of the respondents believed that Gardaí need better resources in order to make arrests and prosecutions for the purchase of sex. 77% believed that women who sell sex often experience some other form of violence or abuse from men who buy sex. 72% believe that women enter the sex trade as a last resort with little other option to support themselves. 70% believed that people who benefit the most from prostitution are criminal gangs. This is a really, really important point because the sex trade is largely fueled by criminal gangs. And also, some people are aware, but for those who aren't aware, the vast majority of the sex trade is made up of middle-class males, middle-aged, who are in relationships, and over half the cohort in this survey bore that out. They believed, 55% believed that men who pay for sexual practices, that men pay for sexual practices that their partner isn't willing to engage in. So that's just a very, very brief snapshot of the survey and of the campaign that we ran out. We're actually closing out this campaign now, and as part of closing out the campaign, we decided to host this webinar as our closing kind of event. It's really important to highlight that prostitution and survivors of sex trafficking, it's a highly, highly gendered phenomenon. It's very hidden, it's very dark, it's often very unspoken about. And it was on that basis we decided to open up a conversation today. So I'm delighted now to be introducing Ruth Breslin. Ruth Breslin is a researcher with SERP, the Sexual Exploitation Research Project in UCD. She's done extensive research in this area, and particularly over COVID-19. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I am just going to share my slides. One moment. There we go. Thanks a million to Barbara, and thank you very much to Rahama for asking me to join in what I think is this really critical conversation, as Barbara says, about something that's, quite hidden, not spoken enough about, or, kind of polished over and made to be seen as some kind of a positive thing. And I think if we look more closely at what's going on in the sex trade in Ireland, we see that that is simply not the case. So as Barbara said, I'm from SERP, the Sexual Exploitation Research Programme in UCD. And when COVID-19 arrived on our shores in Ireland, we started to hear very quickly some very serious concerns that frontline services were identifying, and that women were reporting to frontline services of what was going on for them while they were stuck in Ireland, stuck in the sex trade in the context of a global pandemic. So we were very fortunate indeed to receive some funding from the Community Foundation for Ireland to be able to investigate this a bit further. We thought it was really important to kind of capture some good concrete evidence of what was actually happening for women and what was going on in the trade as the pandemic progressed. So this is a small piece of a larger study that we're currently working on at the moment, which is forthcoming. So it had a wide range of methods, but the focus for today is that I'm going to be talking about our findings arising from some monitoring we did of Ireland's largest prostitution advertising website. Now, just to be clear, I don't have the time to go into the whole context of the kind of profile of the trade here today, but just so we know that much of the vast majority of Ireland's sex trade is in indoor locations. It's advertised online, primarily on one website that has a monopoly in this area. The vast majority of women involved are migrant, many are young, and many are very vulnerable. And women are on this website, they are being advertised there, sometimes controlling their own advertising, sometimes others are controlling it for them. And they're paying obviously to advertise and place their profile on that website in order for buyers to get in touch with them. So we took a snapshot over a series of 14 weeks of the numbers of women being advertised. And of course I say women because the vast majority of those advertised on the site are indeed women. So we took a snapshot of the numbers advertised and how the women were being advertised. And we also did a thematic analysis of buyer reviews. So just for anyone who doesn't know, on the website as well, there's kind of a sort of community of buyers who rate women out of 5 stars on a range of different variables, such as their appearance, the level of satisfaction they provided to the buyer, the value for money he believes that he received from her, and they often detail their kind of so-called encounter with the women on the site. So we looked at those reviews to find out what was going on, particularly to look at the buyer motivations for purchasing sexual access to women in the context of a pandemic. So in doing that, we read and analysed over 1,300 buyer reviews during the monitoring period and did a thematic analysis of those. So I just want to say a little bit first of all about the numbers. So this is the number of individual profiles advertised on the website across our monitoring period. So what you would find in sort of normal times, in pre-COVID times, is that there would be about 650 to 700, so from about 650 to 700 profiles advertised on the website on a daily basis. So what you can see when we started our monitoring, it was in April, At that stage, we're about 5 or 6 weeks into a very heavy, severe, restrictive lockdown in Ireland. And we see there that there was 299 women being advertised on the site, and those numbers going up thereafter. But I suppose what we can see is that gradually, actually, so at the beginning, when we started looking in April, there was less than half the usual number of profiles on the site, but that very clearly increased week on week, all the way till where we come to kind of the end of July. And you can kind of see around a lot of, we really started re-emerging in Ireland from that first heavy lockdown. Sort of around the end of June was when a lot of the economy and society was opening up again. And that's precisely the point at which you can see that the numbers of profiles were basically returning to pre-COVID levels. So, we can see that the trade was essentially getting back to normal in a way. But I think it's really important to go back to the beginning and to look at those weeks of very, very restrictive lockdown. And yet we can still see 300-400 women on the site. So the question for us, and hopefully something we can discuss more about today, is why were there so many women still being advertised on the site? Why did they feel that they had to remain there? Were they being coerced to be there? Lots of, like this raises obviously lots of questions in terms of those numbers. And I suppose one of the things that we need to look at in terms of how the sex trade responded. Absolutely, Barbara's mentioned it. The sex trade is very organised. There is quite a good deal of involvement of criminal gangs and other organisers in the trade who are clearly profiting from the prostitution of others. So when they saw there, and here in particular, we were looking at kind of the response of prostitution advertisers. So of course they saw COVID-19 as an obstacle to their profit because they had less women being advertised on their website, and therefore less advertising revenue coming in. And also at the same time, they were aware that there were less men, definitely a reduction in men going out to purchase sexual access to women, although certainly there still was men doing that. So they kind of addressed it in what seemed like a very benevolent way, because they said that they were working day and night, and they released kind of press releases or statements on their website to say this, that they were working day and night to see how they could make things safer for the women who advertise. So they developed this whole section that they called a non-contact service section of their website. And essentially what that involved was sexual services, prostitution that didn't involve in-person contact. So it was things like webcamming, phone sex, sexting, etc., that buyers could engage in with women, webcamming being the most kind of popular option. And at one point they said that over half the women on the site were advertised in this non-contact section. But actually on a closer inspection, while that was true, a lot of women are advertising in the non-contact area, most of those women are also still seeing buyers in person. So when we scratched underneath the surface a bit further and looked a bit more deeply, we found that there was kind of a smaller subsection, which was called virtual services. And it was the same thing, women who were doing webcamming, phone sex, etc. But these were women who were not seeing buyers at all in person. They were having no in-person contact. So again, we looked at the data on that. So the blue line indicates the women who were still seeing buyers in person, and the pink line indicates those who went virtual only. So they continued in the sex trade, but they're only seeing buyers in that virtual context. And as you can see, it really is a very small number across the monitoring period. Each week it was in around 30 women. So, I mean, there's lots that we could maybe try to deduce from this, but I suppose one of the things I would just say is that we talk about the fact that there are independent women involved in the trade, they're entirely by choice, not subject to coercion, happy with what they're doing. I suppose if we look at these numbers here, we think about who is really independent, who really has a choice, who really has control over their circumstances. I think those numbers really speak volumes. The ones who are able to choose to go virtual, the very tiny number, versus all of these women who clearly did feel that they had no other choice and no other option, but continue to see buyers in person. And of course, very much risking their health in many different ways, including in terms of COVID-19 during that period. Okay, so in terms of our analysis of the buyer reviews, there was a whole range of themes that came out in this analysis, and I've just picked a few out today that I think are important to highlight. So one was this strange contradiction that buyers were very adamant about hygiene. So they started to review women on the basis of how hygienic they were, because these women had hand sanitizer in their premises, or they had access to a shower, or something like that. So they would talk about the importance of hygiene, but obviously that doesn't take away from the fact that they're going to purchase sexual access to a woman in person, which clearly involves very close physical and sexual contact. Nevertheless, they were rating women in the areas of hygiene, so saying, this lady is a hidden gem. Her sense of hygiene during these difficult times, i.e. COVID, is superior, and she's careful and meticulous. So the total contradiction here was that they were seeking hygiene, while at the same time, very clearly, and this was across, very strong theme across so many of the reviews that we read, very clearly demanding and requesting sex acts and sexual practices that would, of course, present a health risk in the context of a pandemic. So this guy is talking about French kissing. I consider myself a pretty good judge of French kissing with my origins and all. And this is the woman that he had purchased sexual access to. This is her profile name on the site. This woman is definitely a close contender for some of the most passionate kisses I've ever shared. So he's talking about French kissing. This guy says the service was top class GFE, which is the girlfriend experience, and he's saying that all services are on offer, no extras needed to be paid for certain services. And here he talks about French kissing, OWO, which is oral sex provided without a condom, and A, which is anal sex. So he's saying all services were still on offer and I didn't have to pay any extra. And he says to all the other guys who are reading, please do yourselves a favor and make an appointment. So some serious contradictions going on there. Then we looked a good deal at what was motivating buyers during this time. So this guy said, I had a dreadful itch for some companionship. So I phoned this woman, petite little thing, had a great time with this little sex bomb. Highly recommended gents in a market not hugely populated with quality at the moment. So what he's acknowledging there is that there is not as many women being advertised at the moment, and maybe not the usual range of choice that he would expect, but nevertheless he had an itch and he needed to have that scratched. So this guy says booking was easy, the language barrier wasn't a problem whatsoever, and I paid for a long session as it's been a while since I visited an escort because of our current situation, and I felt like treating myself. It was money well spent, and she anticipated and accommodated my every fantasy. So what these guys, I suppose, are talking about is, and this is a really common theme that came up a lot, was the extent to which buyers said, I'm really bored at home. I'm really anxious in lockdown. I'm really struggling, I'm finding it very stressful. So I decided to give my little self a little present. I decided to treat myself. So that's what a lot of them talk about. It's just that this was something they deserved. They talk a lot about deserving to be able to go out and purchase sexual access to a woman. This is a really interesting one because a number of buyers talked about their own well-being and particularly their own mental health. And so this guy says, to maintain some small level of sanity, I decided to meet this woman. We've been in touch, but it's not been the same as having physical contact. All the problems in the world just disappeared when we hug and she whispers in that sexy Brazilian accent. This guy says, I was in the city for a necessary family issue and decided to take advantage of this woman's availability. I'll go back to non-contact meetings again, but this appointment was needed. Mental health is important too. And again, this is a recurring theme in terms of buyers wanting to make sure they were looking after themselves and their own well-being. And yet there is not one ounce of concern amongst any of the buyers on the website about the women's circumstances, about the women that they were purchasing sexual access to and why they might still need to be there in prostitution, seeing them present, in person. There was no question in their minds about that. It was all about fulfilling their own needs. Then we found that there was a number of ways in which buyers would complain. So they would give a woman a negative review on the site because they weren't fully satisfied. So this guy says over the phone, all the faves, which are the kind of favorite sex acts that buyers demand, all faves are available, but during the time she suddenly said kissing was not allowed, which disappointed me. I found there was also communication issues, so she didn't speak English fluently, but I will visit again if she allows kissing. And this guy says, nice looking girl, and her photos are definitely her. But I was disappointed that OWO, which is oral sex without a condom, was not included at standard. It normally is on the site at that price. So I suppose what they're saying is that they're not pleased with the service, and there's a sense here of women trying to maintain certain boundaries, perhaps to protect themselves, to protect their health, but buyers not really having a lot of respect for those boundaries. Okay, so this is just really a flavour just to conclude. It's very clear that the prostitution advertisers were able to adapt really quite quickly to protect their profits in some sense, to ensure that they're having not such a significant dip in their revenue. It is also very clear, and again, I think we'll be discussing this more in a moment, that most women had no options but to continue to see buyers in person. And this really is, I think, a stark reminder of how precarious their circumstances are and the pressures they're under to continue to make money for themselves, for their families, for loved ones, for a pimp. And generally, as you can see from those reviews that we just looked at, the sense of sexual entitlement is strong amongst those buyers who continue to purchase sexual access to vulnerable women throughout a global pandemic. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. Hi, my name is Surika. I'm a journalist at the Irish Times, and I'm going to be moderating the discussion which follows that brilliant presentation. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much, Ruth, for going through all those points. It was quite a stark image of what's been happening in the last few months, and it's going to give us a lot to talk about now over the next half hour to 40 minutes. And also, Barbara, thank you for your introduction at the beginning as well. So I want to quickly, before we start speaking, I'd like to introduce our brilliant panel that we have today. You've already met Ruth Breslin, and just for those of you who don't know, Ruth is a researcher with SERP, Sexual Exploitation Research Programme, and which conducts independent feminist research on all forms of commercial sexual exploitation that creates useful knowledge for law and policymakers, practitioners, survivors, supporters, and activists. So Ruth, thank you very much for that presentation. We also have Mary Crilly. Mary is the Chief Executive of Sexual Violence Centre Cork. This provides counselling and support to those who've experienced sexual violence in childhood or as adults. And it also hosts the Cork Against Human Trafficking event. So thank you very much, Mary, for taking part in today's discussion. Next, we have Rachel Moran. Rachel is the co-founder of Space International. It was formed in 2012 for the purpose of changing social attitudes towards prostitution and pressing for its recognition as a sexually exploitative human rights violation. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today. And finally, we've got Sean Cook. Sean is the Chief Executive of the Men's Development Network. This is a non-for-profit organisation which is based in Waterford City, and its focus is being leaders in promoting change and equality within society among men on this, particularly on this issue. So thank you very much, Sean, as well, for joining us. So I'm going to start with quite a broad question to get the discussion going, and there's quite a lot I'd like to cover over the next wee while. So let's just start. I'd like to put it to the whole panel. What do you see as the main challenges that have emerged within the sex trade during COVID-19? And I'd like to start by putting that to Ruth. I know that you touched on some of these things in your presentation, but just specifically the challenges that have emerged for you, and then I'll move on to other members of the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Sarka. I think that an awful lot of people have really realised now in society how a pandemic like this brings into even sharper relief all the inequalities in our society, and how those who are most marginalised and most vulnerable can in many ways be left behind. Because I do feel like women in prostitution were women that were not considered as a, an important group to think about and to address and to look at the needs of when this pandemic hit. As Barbara said, in some ways they're hidden, they're migrant, they're not well integrated into Irish society. People don't necessarily know that they're out there or what's going on for them. And I think in terms of just thinking about the challenges for the women, and I've heard a lot of reports around this in terms of what was happening for the women out there when this pandemic arrived. And many of them were just in a situation that in many ways they're often in. They were very desperate in the financial sense, and they were very isolated. And another thing that was really quite terrifying, I know, for some women was that they actually got trapped in whatever last brothel they were in. So again, I tried to touch a little bit at the beginning on the profile of the women. They're migrant, and many of them are what's known in the trade as touring. They're constantly on the move from location to location. They don't actually have, they're essentially of no fixed abode. They don't have an address, one place that they live and settle. They're often living and sleeping in the same place they see buyers, and they're moving constantly to satisfy the demand in the market for essentially new girls, for new women, for fresh faces. So a lot of women actually, started on the 12th, 13th of March, that they were actually stuck because lockdown arrived, and they were stuck in whatever brothel they had been in last. And they were still required to pay rent in that brothel. They were still required to, if that's where they were going to stay, that's where they're going to live. They were subject to, you know, landlords placing a great deal of pressure on them in terms of them being able to pay their rent. And, you know, I think that was partly a motivation for women, was that they didn't want to be homeless. So their option was to continue to see buyers, and to continue to see buyers in person, because that does command a higher price, obviously, than these virtual, so-called virtual services that were kind of started to become more common during the pandemic. So I think there was just a huge challenge for women in terms of being trapped and in terms of being extremely isolated. And I know services had to work really hard to reach some of these women.
Great, thanks very much, Ruth. There's something that really stood out to me there, what you said at the beginning about the hidden voices during this COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, there's a lot of very vulnerable people across this country, and you mentioned migrant communities, because I know from my own work that migrants were among those who weren't considered in our initial emergency response, but particularly migrant women working in the sex trade, I'd say they were very much bottom of the list. So I think that's a very important point to raise. And also the word trapped. I think trapped is key in this, that this both the physicality of being trapped and also the mental aspect of being trapped. Mary, can I put the same question to you? From your work, what have you seen as problems that have emerged in recent months that people might not be considering when they think about COVID-19, that they might not think of?
Okay, I probably won't directly answer your question, but I mean, that's typical of me, because there are a few things I want to say, and I want to give space for Rachel, who is a survivor, who I think has a lot more to say than I have. I'm in the centre since 1983, so, you know, my involvement in looking at women in the sex trade isn't new. You know, I do welcome this research, I really do, because I receive letters, say, from older men that I'm supposed to feel sorry for, who would kind of say, look, Mary, I was very lonely and I have my needs, and sure, it does no harm. I think that's one message I'd love to get across here, because a lot of people who we would have contact with, besides the ones who feel I shouldn't be involved in this at all and might have different views to I have, you'd have other people out there feeling it's okay, it's fine, it's not a deal. And like, I would have met women in the past 40 years involved in this because of poverty, because they have no choice. It's a bit like women I'd meet who are raped. They had no choice in what happened to their body, because men did. Men subjected them to extreme violence. And that's what I've seen in prostitution. And what I would have seen is women, they're just trapped. They're trapped in poverty, they're trapped economically, they're trapped in so many ways. But really leaves me feeling so angry is our tolerance in society that this is okay, and this is glamorized, and what harm does it do? And it's okay for a young girl to, you know, engage in this. It does no harm. And that's where I feel angry about it. Like, I think the research really showed very clearly how these women are treated as merchandise, how they're bought, how they're sold, how they're treated, how they're graded. And I would have seen that over the years, and I wish other people would see and look at it straight on. I mean, how dare these men go out and decide that they want to treat themselves, not caring what they're doing to this woman, not caring what her life, but that's what it's about. The life of women in prostitution doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. They're termed merchandise, they're kind of bought and sold, and that's the message we need to get across. And even, you know, if these people were prepared to put these women's lives at risk, it didn't matter. They didn't care, because these women didn't matter. You know, and for as long as I'm around, I will be involved in this. I will be shouting about it, because I just think it's so wrong.
I agree with everything you said there, Mary. That was very well put. And I think that leads it's a very clear segue into the question I was going to put to Rachel, because what you said there about women being treated as merchandise, that really, when Ruth was presenting just there about men thinking of their own mental health, or the buyers thinking of their own mental health and their own sense of what they need during a pandemic, that there wasn't any reflection on the humanity of the people involved in the sex trade. Rachel, just over the last few months, what we've seen, the kind of panic that we would have seen at the beginning, obviously we saw the numbers drop down quite significantly, and then they built up again. There are men out there who believe that this is a product that they're going to purchase, and that message is still out there among a certain cohort of men. How do we change that, and how do we move forward from that?
Oh, well, there's a number of ways I think that we ought to do that, and I would certainly start with the websites that are operating as online brothels in the first place. Because, Sorka, if I decided to set up a website tomorrow and invite people to purchase something that it was illegal to purchase, let's say firearms or narcotics, for example, I'd find myself shut down in very short order and imprisoned on top of it. So what I'd like to know is, why are these websites allowed to operate when they are clearly offering people the opportunity to break the law? And it's happening not just every day, but every minute in this country. And that's where I think we need to start. The conversation about male attitudes is a whole other thing. You know, first of all, I'd say that it takes a level of intellectual toddlerhood not to be able to distinguish between your wants and your needs. You know, there is a difference, a very big difference. You know, I don't get to rock up to the bank manager tomorrow and declare that I need €1 million just because I think it might be nice to have that transferred into my bank account. I mean, there's wants and there's needs, and there's a difference, and they apply to sexuality, I would say, even more importantly than, and you know, most of the examples I think that we could come up with. Because when you decide that you have a legitimate need to buy yourself inside of someone else's body, you know, we're into an area of dehumanization there that it's truly disturbing. And I know that COVID-19 has been very, very hard for all of us in a multitude of ways. But for women who are trapped in brothels and live in the understanding that their physical selves are not protected whatsoever from COVID-19, that along with all of the other harm and damage of the sex trade, they're now being exposed to the potential of a virus over and over and over again. So they're separated off, segmented off from society, not worth keeping safe. You know, so I could talk on and on and on about this, but I think that those are the main points I'd like to make.
On that point that you made there about quite simply the health aspect of this, I mean, this virus, we've been living with this virus for months now. We know a lot about how it spreads. And this isn't just, as obviously there is the woman who's involved, the man involved, and then there's the other people who are connected to them in their lives, right? That this is something that spreads very easily. So if a man is choosing to purchase access to sex, that he at that point is also putting people in his life at risk unknowingly. I mean, there's a real chain of human beings here, and a huge risk issue, right? And Rachel, I'd like to ask you to respond to that again.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Every single time that a man has purchased sexual access to women throughout this COVID-19 era, he has risked the health of everybody around him, and in fact of the nation. But that is that's something now that we're looking at, because COVID-19 is something that might affect any one of us. You have to remember as well that every other time COVID-19 is eyed, he's putting his wife, his girlfriend, his fiance, whoever, at risk of any STD you can think of, and at many other risks aside from that. You know, I've had women contact me over the last several years that I've been speaking out publicly on this issue, from really what you might think of as the other side of the fence. And I was amazed when this started to happen. I'd written an article for the Irish Times, and I just mentioned briefly in the space of one paragraph that the other women, the wives, the girlfriends, the fiancés, had not been seen to even merit a mention in this whole campaign, which had at that point been running for years. Well, that opened up floodgates I was never expecting to open. And all of a sudden, the wives and the girlfriends and fiancés and all the rest started contacting me. And I had some amazing conversations, very, very eye-opening. So there's a lot of hurt on the other side of that fence.
I think that's a really important point to make. How many lives are affected by this industry? And Sean, I'd like to chat to you about the important work that you've done, and it ties in with the campaign that's been running this year, the We Don't Buy It campaign. The role that men hold in all of this. I mean, more generally in the discussion pre-COVID-19 around the sex trade, but I think particularly now in this context of COVID-19, you saw the findings from Roots research, which, as I said before, were stark. They really showed a perception among men who purchase purchase access to sex, that they have this right to this, so as Mary called it, a merchandise. How do other men in society, men who do not engage in this kind of behavior, what role do they have to change this perception and to make men understand how wrong this behavior is?
Good morning. Yeah, I think first off, before I answer that, I'd just like to say, when you were talking about the impacts of COVID, I think really what it showed in terms of the research, excuse me, and our experience is just that the vulnerability was just accentuated for women in relation to this particular issue. Like, you know, so like the vulnerabilities that exist as it is for women who are in the sex trades were further enhanced or further extended during this particular period. And I just wanted to kind of to make that point out. But in relation to what, like, it's pretty clear that the majority of men don't go out and buy sexual services, okay? They don't do that, okay? So the question is that where is the space available for those men to be able to come up front and get into a space and say that this is not okay, that this is not a good situation where we actually take advantage and commodify women in this particular way. So that is always the difficulty in relation to that, because I suppose when we talk about we don't buy it campaign, there's always seemed to be a direct kind of poking or seem to be kind of saying men are bad around this particular thing. And certainly, yes, there are a minority of men who go out and do this. But there are a majority of men who don't do it. And we haven't really had a space for them to be able to challenge those other men and challenge their attitudes. So the critical thing for us is to be able to say, you know, that in men who are positive in terms of looking towards gender equality, seeing this particular aspect of purchasing sexual services from women as an affront to gender equality in its own right, that we need to find a space there to be able to talk about that, to be able to confront our friends, our brothers, our fathers, or whoever it may be, who because it's considered normalized behavior, and it has been normalized, and we need to challenge that. And that is the critical thing that we need to do in a positive way, and saying, listen, this is not okay, this is not good, this is not good for the women in your lives, it's not good for your family. And it's really important that we kind of create that space in which to do that. And in a non-judgmental way, because as clearly as we can see, there are certain men, certain sections of society to think that this is okay. And so there is sometimes we've now got a situation where there's a certain element of a stick involved now, where there is an act in place now where the purchase of it is now illegal, okay? And that's very much in an attempt to protect women within the trade and to help them exit the trade. So there is that stick that's there, but the other issues around that cultural shift that needs to happen, that kind of attitude that is there, that prevails and that perpetuates the notion that this is okay and that they want to do that. So that's the critical area of work that well, from our perspective, that we would like to do, and try and provide and create those spaces for where men can have those conversations and have those conversations with women and work as allies with women's organizations in which to address this particular issue. And it's why we're here today. It's why we're part of this particular campaign.
I think you're entirely right. It's about conversations and not just accepting something that exists in society and leaving it to one side and thinking that doesn't affect me, that this is a discussion that across Irish society we should be having. I'd like to put this question to Barbara, but it is also generally for the panel. So do let me know if you do stick up your hand if you'd like to answer or jump in, whichever suits. It's in regards to kind of the frontline services that have been needed over the last few months, because services did have to adapt with regards to COVID-19, both around safety measures, but also the needs that people had evolved and changed, as we've seen from the research. Barbara, what have Rahama been doing over the last few months to meet that demand?
Yeah, all services have had to adapt, obviously, with COVID-19. So initially in the lockdown, most of our services went online. We remained open in terms of the office was open, and we provided sexual health packs throughout the pandemic. But most of the services, in terms of our education and development service and our counselling, everything went online initially. That proved hugely challenging, because we've women coming from all over the country. They don't have access to Wi-Fi. Some of them don't have smartphones. Some of them don't have tablets. And so it was very, very challenging to get people set up online. So a lot of women were without a service. Thankfully, we did get some funding from the Department of Justice, and we were able to provide emergency care packs, because obviously finance was a big issue as well. So we were able to provide food vouchers and some electronic equipment such as tablets and phones. So they were some of the initial challenges. I would say the social isolation was again a massive challenge. So when we delivered the emergency care packs around the country, people were incredibly grateful and incredibly gracious to receive them. But the feedback when I spoke to individuals was, as much as they appreciated what was in the pack, the biggest thing they appreciated was the staff member who delivered it and having the human face-to-face contact. So while we've all learned to adapt to online, and it has got us through a period, and some things we may continue, nothing beats face-to-face contact, particularly for women who are often in distress and highly traumatized. And for a lot of migrant women, they have no family, they have no friends here in Ireland. So they don't have, you know, a huge network to start with. In fact, some of them have hardly any network. So contact with services is more important than ever. And I suppose just the other issue, you know, that, you know, going back to what was really, really challenging, not only just that were people stuck in brothels, but a number of people became homeless because they lost their housing overnight. And that proved very problematic. So service had to adapt to try and get people into emergency accommodation, where we had to get people. Now that has been an ongoing issue, but it definitely escalated during COVID-19.
Mary, you wanted to jump in there?
I do, just something quick. I think, you know, voluntary centres are very resilient because we've dealt through the years with no funding, with lots of things. And I just want to say to Sean, I really appreciate what the Men's Development Network are doing. But in all my years, I've never found a space where men haven't found a space to talk, because men find a space and they do it. Like if you look at an example of, you know, during COVID, rape still went on. The old myth that it was just young girls getting drunk or getting raped was gone, but the women were still getting raped. And the men talked about it and they bragged to their friends about it. They mightn't call it rape, but they say, I did whatever to her last night and she doesn't even remember it. They will brag about it. And the same thing with men who go to brothels, they will tell their friends and their friends know. And you don't kind of find a space, you take it. You really take it. Because, I mean, of us as women, we're trying to find a space to talk about the sexual violence in Ireland, that 1 in 5 girls are raped in their lifetime, that 1 in 5 girls are raped as children, and 1 in 7 boys. If we were waiting to get the space in this country, we would have never got it. So we just need to take it. And the idea of men not being able to take space is bizarre, you know. So I do want to say to people out there that you can make such a massive difference. I know sometimes listening to this, you might think we're wrong because prostitution is glamorized so much, but you can make an amazing difference, because where I'm coming from would be women and men who would come into the centre who maybe would have said when they were children they were raped, and then in teenage years they ended up on the streets or doing various things that they feel shame about. Now, why the hell should they feel shamed? You know, they were subjected to male violence from a very early age, but that's what they feel. And what I want to say to them is, you really matter, and you can talk to anybody about it, and it's not your shame, you know, because we sometimes just find a focus on one area, where there's lots of other women and Irish women out there who've gone through a lot more and a lot less. And all I'm saying is, you know, you really matter. You really matter. And we really need conversation going, and just take the space.
Yeah, no, that's very, very, very important point, Mary. I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to get time for a few questions, but there's just one final question I want to put to Rachel myself. Just again, focusing on the buyers and people who are buying sexual access to women. I mean, what do you think, Rachel, is prompting them to take these risks that they see as personal risks, but are actually, they're putting, as we spoke before, other people's risks, other people's lives at risk, particularly the women who they are engaging with sexual activity with, but also families, friends. So what is prompting them to do this?
Well, if you were to deliver it as bluntly as possible, I would say sexual selfishness. You can just break it down that simply. It's putting your own sexual desires front and center, above and beyond absolutely everything, predominantly the humanity of the person whose body you're using. And And I don't believe for a minute that these men don't realize what they're doing to be morally wrong. And we don't use that term nearly often enough, by the way, because there are still rights and wrongs in this world, thank God. And, you know, this is one of them. And they know it's wrong. And you only have to imagine the looks on any one of their faces if they were to walk into a brothel and see their own sister sitting on the bed, or their mother, or their daughter, or their wife. They know it's wrong. They just don't give a damn, because their almighty orgasm is the king of the situation. That's exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, it's bluntly put, but I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I've been passed on some questions here by our webinar host. I know there's a lot of questions coming in, so we're only going to have time for a couple. The first one that I'd like to put to the panel is, do you think that COVID-19 has brought permanent changes in the sex trade that will inform future service provision? So I suppose that's in reference to a lot more the way websites evolved their services to make it less contact focused and the more kind of online services, but also there were other changes. As we know, as we've seen from the research, the majority of women continue to meet people in person. So all these changes, these small and large changes we've seen, do you think they'll continue once the vaccine is distributed? I'd like to put that to Ruth first, actually.
I think what I found, and I'm definitely not a kind of tech whiz, but I think what I found was, in terms of the sex trade, how it operates and how it advertises, that the pandemic was the mother of all invention. So in terms of the website that I focus on today, they obviously said that they worked morning, noon and night to roll out this new kind of non-contact service. But at the same time, they also rolled out a new platform, which is modeled very much along the lines of OnlyFans, which many people will be familiar with, a subscription service that people subscribe to, so that you're the fan of the person you subscribe to. But there tends to be, you know, quite a lot of sexual content on there, the sharing of or the sharing with your fans of videos, pictures, etc., of a sexual nature. But this website has created their own version of that now. And more women who are active on the website are also now on that platform too. So I think what we see is a move of women, some women, into a space where they're more engaged in essentially what is prostitution, but online, although I suspect many of them are also still engaged, as we saw, in person as well. And I feel like this is just one of the new frontiers in terms of another way to access women for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So a lot of people will say, well, it's much safer because you're not in the room with the guy, etc. But I think we've seen very recently the implications of what's happening in the virtual space for women, with their images, their videos being stolen, being passed on, being shared potentially for commercial gain, and the loss of control that women have over those images. So some women who have been in prostitution have said to me, at least I knew that the transaction was over once that buyer left the room. That was it was done. Now transactions, or, you know, in terms of that kind of sexual engagement online, the record of that now exists forever. So this, you know, there's absolutely, there are new kind of frontiers and new ways, I think, that women are going to be harmed. And I suppose the only positive I can see in that is that I can really see for frontline service providers in Ireland that the pandemic required them to invent and be innovative and respond and adapt and change their services in a really positive way. So I think, you know, maybe we're always playing catch up. We have to keep on top of what the trade is up to. We have to watch it, we have to monitor it, and we have to see what the women need and respond to their support needs accordingly.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Is there anyone else in the panel who'd like to add to that?
Yeah, Sarah, I'd like to just come in on that. I recently spoke to a survivor of sex trafficking, and one of her biggest issues and fears was online imaging and the videos that had been taken of her. And that was held as a threat to her, that it would be shown to her family back in her current country of origin. And she was very traumatized and didn't sleep for months, worrying would her man see them images. And I could sense when I met her the level of trauma and anxiety that carried for her. And eventually one day her mother said to her, actually, you know, I have seen, and I know you didn't, you know, that you were coerced into that. I know you didn't willingly do what I saw in them videos. And she told me that was the first time she'd had a proper night's sleep in absolute months. So the online stuff is so damaging. It's hard to really comprehend and really, I can't I suppose, emphasize it. On the flip side of that then, just in terms of services and one of the positives of COVID in terms of frontline service provision, we've been able to reach people all around the country online that we weren't previously able to do. We've never had so many people in our groups, because they can. Now that took a lot of work in terms of setting up, going back to my previous point about the Wi-Fi difficulties and access to technology. But when that got sorted, and there's still issues obviously with Wi-Fi in some parts of the country, but when the technology piece got sorted, the sign up for group work, so that is something positive we will be keeping going into the future, in terms of, you know, while it's really important to stick, or not to stick, but to ensure we have the face-to-face contact, which is what people are requesting. But for service users who are very, very far away in the country, it's essential that we keep the online group and the one-to-ones going, because it's a huge way of connection for service users.
Yeah, on that note, actually, one of the, it feeds in perfectly to another question that was sent in, was to how organizations have had to, any gaps that have emerged in the way that organizations operate, or the way that you operated before COVID-19, issues that have arisen that you never would have thought of before. Sean, can I ask, through your work, has anything arisen in the last few months that you perhaps wouldn't have thought about, and that you feel is important to hone in on now?
No, I suppose that like we don't provide a frontline service in relation to the area, so like it's like what Rohama would do. But I think what it has indicated to us is very much around that element of privilege that sometimes exists, and it kind of has been accentuated. And when you asked the question earlier on, Rachel, about kind of what changes, like, you know, nothing is certainly in terms of that kind of men's sense that they're right of privilege around being able to go out and buy sexual access, you know, that they think they can do that. I think that COVID, in some ways, the rationale for why they do it was even the same reason why they did it during COVID is only exacerbated by it. Like, you know, there's the same lack of empathy, the same lack of understanding in relation to what they're actually doing. And I think Rachel is right. They're acutely aware of sometimes that the harm that they're doing, or that this is morally wrong. And but I think for that very reason, during COVID, they just ignored all those type of things, as they'd done before anyway, and further ignored it during the period, even though it put themselves, those women that they were with, and the rest of their families at risk. Yeah. So.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. We're coming up close on time. I guess, Rachel, if I could put the final question to you before we wrap it up. How do we move forward from here? What are the next steps? We're looking at, where all of us are seeing on the news now in the next few weeks, vaccines are being rolled out, the return to whatever normality will be post-COVID-19. How should organizations working with people, working alongside people who work in the sex trade, but also the general public, move forward on this issue going into 2021 and improve on where we were this time a year ago?
Well, I think I would put it back to the government, actually, first and foremost, Saoirse, because there has got to be a very serious funding injection into this issue. I mean, if you look at any area of male violence against women, whether it's domestic violence or rape or prostitution, those services are always anywhere between underfunded and chronically underfunded, depending on what's going on with the economy. And I really think that service provision and the cash injection into service provision is crucial here, because there's no point saying to a woman, you deserve more, you're worth more, if you can't give her access to more. And as far as, I mean, there are just so many gaps. I think there's a huge gap in the area of residential support, and I'm sure Barbara can speak to that. You know, if a woman doesn't have a place to lay her head, she's as vulnerable as a person has ever been. And I can speak to, you know, experience from that, because I got into prostitution from a position of homelessness. It's absolutely heartbreaking to me to know that there were women who lost the roofs over their head because of COVID, when the roofs that they had over their head to begin with where it was just a space where they were being abused and violated in. It's horrendous, and I think the government needs to put its money where its mouth is on this issue.
It's very well said, Rachel. I think we're coming up on time, so I just want to thank everyone for their contributions today. We have touched on many issues, and I know we could sit here easily for another hour because there is just so much to cover, and it's such an important topic. But I think we've in this discussion, we have touched on some very important points around what COVID brought up when it comes to the purchase of sexual access of women. So I mean, everything around increased risks of homelessness, as you said, Rachel, quite rightly there, the need for more financial support around residential supports, also the buyer's mentality over the last few months, the sense of selfishness, quite frankly, of their mental health, without thinking about the mental health of those who are involved in their decision making, and the women, predominantly women, who have been trapped during this pandemic in a way that most of us could never completely understand. So I'm really grateful to everyone for taking part today, and thank you to Ruhama for asking me to moderate this discussion. It's so important, and I think men and women, we all have a role to play in continuing the conversation about this and ensuring that policymakers and the population at large understands that changes need to be made. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mary, Rachel, Sean, Ruth, and Barbara. And I'm going to pass you on to Barbara to just close us off.
Thanks very much, Sorcha. I'd just like to give a few thank yous. I'd particularly like to thank our partners, Mary, Rachel, Sean, in terms of the We Don't Buy It campaign. I'd like to thank Ruth for joining us today from SERPA, and I'd like to thank you, Sorcha, for moderating what is a difficult subject. It's very polarised, it's very difficult, but most importantly, it's very hidden. So I think this is the start of a number of conversations. It's not the first conversation in terms of prostitution, but there isn't enough conversations. So hopefully there will be more. I'd also just like to thank and acknowledge all the staff in Ruhama who worked incredibly hard throughout COVID and continue to always work hard. And also acknowledge Amanda Keane, who was instrumental in the development of the We Don't Buy It campaign. I suppose it's really, really important to acknowledge the women in the sex trade and their resilience in the face of adversity and diversity. You know, the pandemic has shone a light, I suppose, on an awful lot of things for all of us, in that we were very much isolated, but it's very much their world all the time, where they're incredibly isolated, incredibly stigmatized, and with very, very little social connection. So I do think it's really important to acknowledge the women. I'd also like to acknowledge the Department of Justice who funded the We Don't Buy It campaign, and to thank them for funding the campaign. I suppose I said at the outset, sexual violence is hidden, it's dark, it's unspoken about. So I would just like to finish with a quote from Tony Kirwan, and it's: "Dare to enter the darkness, to bring another into the light." Thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye to everyone. Thank you.